And so Paul and his companions passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia on their way to Thessalonica. And Paul taught in the synagogue, and a few of the Jews and a large number of Greeks, including many prominent women, were persuaded by his message about Jesus. But some other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up a mob and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they didn't find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Paul and Silas went to the synagogue there, and Paul taught the people about Jesus. And Luke writes that the Berean Jews were of nobler character than the Thessalonians, and they accepted what Paul said after having examined the scriptures to see if what he said could be backed up. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Paul was distressed to see Athens full of idols, so he went to the synagogue in the marketplace to preach about the resurrection of Jesus. And some Greeks took him to a meeting at the Areopagus, the high court in Athens, to explain himself. The Areopagus literally meant the rock of Ares, and was a center of temples, cultural facilities, and a high court. It was actually illegal to preach a foreign deity in Athens, so Paul's sermon was in fact a combination of a guest lecture and a trial. His sermon addresses 5 main issues. In his introduction, he discusses the ignorance of pagan worship. Then he discusses the one creator, God, being the object of worship. Then God's relationship to humanity, and then how idols of gold, silver, and stone are to be seen as objects of false worship. Then he concludes saying that it's time to end the ignorance. Paul begins his address by emphasizing the need to know God rather than worshiping the unknown. He says, "As I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you." Paul then explained concepts such as the resurrection of the dead and salvation, and after the sermon, a number of people became followers of Paul. These included a woman named Damaris and Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus.